crime after crime. You pretend it's religion, like there's no one to blame for the dead.
Welcome to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, October 7th, 2021, and we are coming to you live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. I'm Mary Massey, and along with me is co-host John SAKOWICZ. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to our audience listening here in Northern California and to our audience listening throughout the country and the world via the World Wide Web.
Today's show and all programs will be archived here at KMUD and at our program website, heroespatriots.org. I hope you will check that out. You as listeners may call in with questions for our guests. That number, 707-923-3911. We will take as many calls as time permits, and we ask that you be brief with your question. Our thanks to our wonderful engineer this morning, Dorothy Sakur, for assisting with today's program. Views and opinions expressed during this program do not necessarily reflect those of the board, staff, or volunteers of KMUD Community Radio. John, we've been doing a series of programs commemorating the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We've had guests such as Colleen Rowley, Time Person of the Year, Graham McQueen, and Cynthia McKinney, all talking about what is and isn't true about the events of 9/11. And today we're going to continue that show.
Yeah, it's a really good series. Of course, we're marking the 20th year anniversary of 9/11. And there are many people out there, including former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney and Time Magazine Person of the Year, FBI whistleblower Colleen Rowley, who have been fighting for truth and justice for 9/11 findings. They're fighting on behalf of those who died, and they're fighting on behalf of the survivors, the families. And we're honored to be able to speak truth to power on 9/11.
And in 9/11 circles, our guest is known as a whistleblower. So let's get into it. Kevin Ryan is a chemistry laboratory manager with 30 years of experience and a degree from Indiana University. He is the editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies and has published several 9/11 related articles in mainstream scientific journals, including all articles on the finding of thermitic materials at the World Trade Center. We'll be spending a full hour with Kevin Ryan as we hear about his investigation into the reported findings following the 9/11 attacks and what we as citizens have been told. Kevin co-authored books with David Griffin, Peter Scott, Paul Zaremka, and Jesse Ventura. He authored his own book called Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects. Kevin Ryan, welcome to the program as a first-time guest.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. If you can stay close to your microphone, that would be helpful. We want to start with just understanding, since your background is chemistry and managing a lab, how did you get involved with 9/11, specifically the studies of thermitic material?
Yeah, well, I get involved with questioning the events of 9/11 because I worked for a company called Underwriters Laboratories. And just 2 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, the CEO of our company came to my division in South Bend, Indiana, and told us that our company had certified the steel components used to build the World Trade Center for fire resistance. And that is one of the many things that Underwriters Laboratories does. It tests materials for fire resistance. And of course, the official account of what happened on 9/11 is that the steel components failed from fire and collapsed in an unprecedented manner, the 3 buildings. And so I began to ask questions about that at work and wasn't getting very good answers about it over a period of about a year. This was from 2003 to 2004. And so I ended up writing directly to the National Institute for Standards and Technology, the government agency under the Department of Commerce that was investigating the World Trade Center destruction. And I wrote to them, and I allowed those questions to become public, ended up getting fired from UL, and that's where my journey began with 9/11.
Wow. John, you had a question. I know we had many people from Facebook that John knows that we announced that this program was taking place. And we have a series of questions that we ourselves have, but also from our listeners.
Yeah. Hi, Kevin. Thanks so much for being on the show. I also want to say before we start, I dedicate this show to my friend Michael C. Rupert, the author of Crossing the Rubicon, the former, the now deceased L.A. Gold Shield detective who called out the CIA on cocaine trafficking, but also moved his focus to 9/11. Mike died of an apparent suicide not far from where Mary and I are sitting right now in Calistoga, California. And Mike was fearless. He was courageous. He was a true American hero. He was a true patriot. So I just want to honor Mike's memory before we get started. So Kevin, I blog and we have podcasts, and I've got 5,000 friends on Facebook and lots of followers. And they've submitted when I posted the announcement, the press release for the show, they submitted questions. So let's get started with the first question, and it's right up your area of expertise. It's on the thermite. It's on the temperatures at which steel will melt, and this is the exact question. Why do demolition experts continue spending weeks planting in position, cutting charges, and setting them off in a precisely timed manner when the building collapses of 9/11 obviously proved that burning jet fuel works as well in less than an hour, or so we're told? If the official story is true, can't we just set fire to some kerosene and within an hour the whole thing will collapse in a uniform manner into its own footprint with minimal collateral damage? I don't think jet fuel burns hot enough to do that. It burns at a lower temperature than charcoal, which is why we use starter fluid, essentially the same as jet fuel, to light up our grills. But strangely, the barbecue grill does not collapse or incinerate into ashes.
You're right.
Try and see that. So if it wasn't jet fuel that caused the towers to collapse, what caused the buildings to collapse on 9/11?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it actually is at the core of the questions I was asking back in 2003 and 2004, because the official accounts, which of course changed over a period of years and contradicted each other as they changed, were all going back to the idea that jet fuel fires or office furnishing fires in the buildings could have weakened or melted the steel in the structural steel in the buildings. And it got to the point where the mainstream media was reporting just absurd ideas that the steel throughout 5 full floors of a tower would have melted. And frankly, there's a couple of things to note. Jet fuel, the jet fuel in the World Trade Center burned off in just a few minutes. It burned off in 5 minutes. Everybody agrees with that, including the official account. The official account is that those fires, which were initiated by jet fuel, continued on for a period of time and reached temperatures that could have somehow weakened the floors and the core columns and the perimeter columns of the building. But the fact that the evidence that they obtained, they did exacting testing, a couple of different types of tests on World Trade Center steel that had been saved, and in the temperatures that were reached according to the testing was only about 250 degrees Celsius. So just to give you an idea, steel doesn't melt until it's about 1,600 degrees Celsius or 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. So, 250 degrees Celsius, which is what the testing they were able to establish showed, is far too low to weaken or melt structural steel. So that was one of the questions I was asking. How could this story stand up, given that the testing that NIST had done did not support it? On to your other question, how could the buildings have collapsed? I think it's clear to most of us now who have examined it, that the buildings collapsed due to the placement of explosive charges and also due to the use of thermitic materials throughout the building. So then the question, of course, leads to, how did that happen and who could have done it? But that's for another question.
Right, and
Wow.
so that goes to the heart of the 9/11 problem. We don't know who did it, but we know that what we were told isn't the truth. So we know what didn't happen. We don't know. We know what happened. We don't know who did it. Essentially. So as a follow-up to that question, why wasn't 9/11 treated like a crime scene? They cordoned off the area. They didn't test for thermite or other explosives that could have cut through steel. Everything was cut as scrap steel and shipped off to China, where it was melted down and put into Chinese steel mills. 9/11 was not treated like a crime scene by forensic scientists. Why was that?
That's a great question, and the truth of the matter, I think, is that if they treat it like a crime, they would have to proceed in a criminal investigation that would require certain things be done. You mentioned testing for explosive residues. That's something that's required by the National Fire Protection Agency Act, NFPA 921. So it requires, in a criminal investigation of an arson, that the presence of residues of explosive or incendiary materials be tested. That was not done. Another thing that was not done in a normal criminal investigation related to a plane crash is the NTSB taking over and rebuilding the planes, and doing a full investigation of exactly how those planes could have crashed. So those are two examples of how criminal investigations were not conducted. But there are other examples. And you mentioned Mike Rupert, who I happened to have met in New York in 2010, and he was a leading voice for 9/11 truths for many years. One of the things that he was able to bring to light that others didn't speak a lot about was the insider trading related to 9/11. And I wrote my own article about insider trading on 9/11, and that was published in a book along with Jesse Ventura. And, we talk about the fact that there were suspects who were flagged by the Securities Exchange Commission for insider trading related to 9/11. And these suspects were not even questioned by the 9/11 Commission or the FBI. They were assumed to have no ties to Al-Qaeda, and therefore they could not have had something to do with 9/11. That was the logic, kind of the circular logic. So, yeah, there was no criminal investigation. That's a great point. And as often as possible, I like to refer to 9/11 as the 9/11 crimes, because that's what they were. Somebody committed crimes, the investigation was not conducted, and we still don't know exactly who did it, and to some extent exactly how it happened.
Yeah, Kevin, you hit the nail on the head with that, with the trading of the insider trading on put options on airline stocks right before 9/11. In some of the email correspondence that we had before the show, I was hired in 1979 at Alex Brown & Sons by the guy who was at the center of this. His name is A.B. Buzzy Krongard, Krongard. He was the managing partner at Alex Brown & Sons. He later engineered their IPO, then the merger and acquisition of Alex Brown to Bankers Trust, and then engineered the merger and acquisition of Bankers Trust with Deutsche Bank, and was the vice chairman at Deutsche Bank at the time of 9/11, I believe. Buzzy Krongard was also the number 3 guy at the CIA. So he had these dual careers. He lived in an alternative universe. He worked on he was a top executive on Wall Street, but he was the number 3 guy at the CIA. George Tenet hired him. And the SEC had records of insider trading before the 9/11 attacks that Buzzy Krongard had bought a ton of put options on airline stocks, making tens of millions of dollars. And then immediately after 9/11, those SEC records were completely disappeared, Kevin. That's unprecedented. Buzzy is now the lead outside director at DSL Piper, it's called the CIA of law firms. And so Buzzy is still doing what Buzzy does. There were no recriminations. There was no accountability. There were no indictments. There was no investigation. There was no nothing. and yet insiders made a ton of money on the collapse of the Twin Towers on 9/11. A ton of money. Why?
I can say that my opinion is that the reason that the investigation did not occur is that it would lead to areas that, people are not allowed to question. And you mentioned the CIA. Buzzy Krongard was the executive director of the CIA in that period of time. He was also, as Mike Rupert pointed out, in charge of the company that made the put options on United Airlines. And so, these are people that are beyond questioning to some extent. George Tenet, you mentioned George Tenet. He is somebody that I strongly believe knew what happened and was involved in making sure it did happen, in my personal opinion. And, he also went on to lie to Congress. He lied to the 9/11 Commission. And, these are things that are crimes in themselves. Lying to Congress is a crime, whether you're under oath or not.
Right.
But he lied under oath about the CIA's foreknowledge of the alleged hijackers. He lied to the 9/11 Commission by not telling them about the torture videos that his subordinates later destroyed. And, George Tenet is a big suspect in this whole situation with regard to 9/11. And so is another guy, Louis Freeh, who was the FBI director in the years leading up to 9/11.
Buzzy's brother is another player in this. His name is Cookie Krongard. No, really. This sounds like it's like a cartoon strip, like a Bugs Bunny strip, Buzzy and Cookie. But these guys are lethal. They're scary lethal. But Cookie Krongard was the Inspector General of the Department of Defense during the tenure of Donald Rumsfeld. And Cookie Krongard is the one who engineered the private military contractors to fight our wars in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. They ushered in the age of companies like Blackwater. So Buzzy and Cookie and Donald Rumsfeld and that whole gang ushered in this whole multi-trillion-dollar industry of private military contractors. So when people say, well, who had something to gain? I say it was the military-industrial complex. It was the private military-industrial complex. AOC and the gang have estimated that $21 trillion has been spent on the so-called war on terror, domestic and foreign, since 9/11. So if you're looking for motivation, $21 trillion, and a big part of it going to private military contractors is enough motivation to bring down the towers, in my view. What do you think, Kevin?
Well, yeah, I think, 9/11 as a whole was a coup that was intended to bring about the seizure of resources and the control of the population. And, it's part of, I think, an ongoing agenda, in my opinion. And so, we need to get to the bottom of this at some point. And so I think 9/11 insider trading, for example, is a great opportunity for us to look even more closely at this. For example, one of the other suspects named by the SEC in their the classified documents that were later released by the 9/11 Commission was the guy who ran the electronic security for the World Trade Center complex. His name is Dexter Walker. And he and his wife were named very openly in this previously classified document as having made trades that looked like 9/11 insider trades.
Wow.
And they were never questioned. Never questioned. This is absurd. If the guy who ran the electronic access to the complex, you would think would have a great deal to question or to answer for with regard to who might have put explosives in the building. Because, if you control electronic access, you can not only give access when needed, but you can prevent access as well. So, Dexter Walker is, I think, somebody who needs to be looked very closely at. He also has a very strong family history of CIA and deep state connections going back to Russell and Company back in the 1800s. So, yeah, the first Dexter Walker was son of James Monroe Walker, who was an agent for the for the folks who did the Russell & Company folks who did the Opium Wars activities.
Yeah.
So I think there's a long history of hundreds of years of a network of people who conduct these kinds of crimes. That's my personal opinion. And Ward Dexter Walker, I think, is part of that. I think that other people who were involved in 9/11 are also kind of controlled by that shady group, whoever they might be.
Right. It's 23 minutes past the hour, and we are speaking with Kevin Ryan about the collapse of the towers and subsequent findings. You know, you mentioned that you used to work with, you were fired rather from Underwriters Laboratories, UL, and you said that they certified, if you will, what would make a building like this collapse. And the final theory was it was the pancake theory. 3 hours to collapse a floor and fires, 2 hours for the beams. That didn't happen. The South Tower collapsed in 56 minutes. So for those that are still not believing that something else is amiss, could you just sort of look again at what the building was certified to withstand?
Yeah, it's a great point, Mary. And, you know, the New York City Code in 1968, during the time that the buildings were being constructed back in the 60s, required that the column assemblies that were used in this building were able to withstand 2 hours of intense fire in a test that's done in a furnace. So Underwriters Laboratories would take models of these column assemblies, and they'd put them in the furnace, and they'd apply a load to those, and they'd see if the steel components would fail and to withstand the load and to withstand the fire. And so they needed to hold for at least 2 hours. And then the floor assemblies needed to hold as well for a couple of hours. And so that's the thing that, as you pointed out, the South Tower collapsed in only 56 minutes, and the North Tower collapsed in 120 minutes. So, you know, this doesn't really add up. If the steel components were tested as we know they were, not only from the CEO but also through other means, the building should not have collapsed due to fire in any way. And also, I mentioned the testing that NIST did, but my company participated in that investigation. And back in 2004, after I'd started asking questions, I was also in Chicago at the time when they were doing some of these tests on floor assembly models. They had made mock-ups of the floor assemblies of the World Trade Center to test them again to see if we stripped off all the fireproofing, would that make them collapse in 56 minutes? And no, I mean, they were able to prove that that wouldn't happen either back in 2004. And that was the end of a theory that the official investigators had been using for 3 years called the pancake theory. Mm-hmm. Pancake theory required the floors to collapse, and since they didn't collapse in the test, they no longer mentioned the pancake theory, and this came out and said it was not relevant. So ultimately what the official account is about is what we call the pile driver theory, and that is that the upper floors softened or weakened and started to fall somehow, and then they collapsed down and compressed the 70 to 90 stories of cold steel below them, which in itself is not really a realistic theory, but that's what we're left with. And so, the testing did not support the official account, and the official accounts were largely based on computer models that we're not allowed to see. So, engineers that I'm associated with have requested those computer models by FOIA and have been told that they can't be shared because they would jeopardize public safety. So, what kind of safety, I'm not sure, but it's very suspicious. The official investigations are provably false. And, I think from there we have to understand that this is a deception. 9/11 was a deception and has a lot more to do than to do with than just the buildings, of course. We've been lied to repeatedly about how the planes were notified. We were notified about the hijackings or not notified. NORAD was. And lots of different stories about that contradict each other over the years. So the deception is quite extensive, and the buildings we know could not have fallen or been destroyed without explosives.
Kevin, we're going to take a brief pause. It's 28 minutes past the hour, and this station is in its fund drive. So we're going to turn it back over to Dorothy for a little station business. Thank you. I want to mention that folks can call in, and we do have a caller for you, Kevin Ryan. So let's get right to the phone call.
Yes, thank you. First, I just want to reinforce I'm a donor to KMUD, and I fully endorse supporting KMUD as much as possible. It's a great station.
Thank you,
Mr. Ryan. I wanted to go back to what you said about sort of the co-opting of the political and economic situation through 9/11, and the role of the fantastic technical analyses that you're doing. I know that engineers have a very strong ethical code that they follow, and I'm wondering, to get this story even more widespread than on your writing on the excellent show today, is there a way of mobilizing engineers, drawing on the engineering associations around the country to give this great, because this is really calling into question engineering expertise and value. And I just wonder, even 20 years later, if there's a way that you could use the profession to make this story better heard.
Thank you for the question. And, there are efforts in that regard. You may have heard of a group that started up a couple of years after I was fired called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And they have a petition in which architects and engineers, in the number of over 3,000 of them, are calling for a new investigation into the World Trade Center destruction. So, can we get a majority of engineers to speak out? I think that's difficult, and the reason it is that I'm an example of the fact that if people speak out publicly against a power story like that of the 9/11 crime, they face professional ostracization. I was fired. I have examples of other people my colleagues who were fired from universities and such for speaking out about 9/11. It's a very sensitive story that's really at the root of the power structure of not only the United States, but really a global sort of empire. And so I think that your point is good, though, that we need to continue to push into the academic and the professional circles to just demonstrate. If people see it more often, they're more likely to recognize that we can't live with this kind of deception and not answer it and not investigate it further. So, it's not just the facts related to explosive demolition of the buildings. But, I mentioned, or Mary did at the beginning of the show, that we have done research that has shown that thermitic materials were found throughout the World Trade Center dust. That means that thermitic materials means residues of a reaction called thermite. And thermite is a very high energy, very, very high energy, high temperature reaction that leads to the melting of steel and metal. And there's a lot of evidence for the melting of metal at the World Trade Center. And so this is really only explicable in terms of the presence of the thermite, because as we discussed earlier, the official accounts show that, the fires themselves would not have resulted in molten metal, but something actually did in the rubble and at the base of the buildings in particular. So we need to reach out to academics and engineering professionals to bring them that information, and that's really the ongoing work of groups like Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, Scientists for 9/11 Truth, and others who are really trying to make that happen.
So, I was also thinking about the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in the basement, where I think 4 or 5 people were killed and many were injured. Did that? Is there any relationship to that materials that were examined to the subsequent 2001 materials?
Well, I'm not aware of any, but there's some differences in those events. So the 1993 was a bomb in the basement brought in by a van. It's my understanding, and the World Trade Center event in 2001 was far more extensive, where the collapse of the building required the failure of literally thousands of fasteners and connections throughout the building, kind of not simultaneously like in Building 7, but in a sequence, in a time sequence that didn't really happen in 1993. In 1993, I think the people who were accused are sometimes linked to the people who were accused in 2001. However, if we have time to discuss more about that, the people the accused alleged hijackers on 9/11 and their accomplices, they really were very suspicious people in themselves, and and there's a lot to be discussed with regard to that popular myth that was created and how that really might connect to what actually happened, because I feel like the creation of the myth and then the takedown of the buildings are connected in the overall operation.
Kevin, I've got, again, lots of questions that came through me through the blog and through Facebook and Instagram, what have you. And I'd like to get through them almost like in a deposition, have you answer yes, no, or maybe. But before I do, I want to get to why all the vitriol, why all the real hate and insult and anger towards people who are trying to seek the truth about things that don't add up to 9/11. Mike Rupert had a theory about why people try to tar and feather people like you as quote unquote conspiracy theorists. Whether it's the JFK assassination or the Martin Luther King assassination or the Robert Kennedy assassination or 9/11. He wears a tinfoil hat. He's a conspiracy theorist. Well, Mike would say, number one, everything is a conspiracy because Homo sapiens is a communal animal. Everything involves a group of people, a conspiracy of people. So the word conspiracy in itself is neither here nor there. It's not pejorative. And as far as theory is concerned, everything starts with a theory. You go from, in law, you go from a theory and you look for evidence to prove a case. You look at the evidence. So the term conspiracy theorist should not be pejorative, and yet it's like the deepest insult, apparently, that truth seekers like former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, who was on our show, or 2002 Time Magazine Person of the Year, Colleen Rowley, they've been painted with that brush, conspiracy theorists. Why such the hate and rancor towards people who are just trying to find out the truth?
Okay. So, 9/11 was definitely conspiracy unless you believe that it is perpetrated by one person acting alone, which doesn't make any sense. So it definitely was conspiracy. And why do people, why are they triggered by this term conspiracy theory? Well, that's the creation of the media and really the folks who are behind the original implementation of that term. So, there was a time in the 60s when people were questioning the Warren Commission report, and there was a CIA memo that came out that told the mainstream media to begin to use the terms conspiracy theorist and conspiracy theory to address these kinds of questions. And since then, it's been very useful. And I looked into, for example, at the New York Times and the Washington Post, how often the terms conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorists had been used before that memo came out and after. And before, the term conspiracy theorist had never been used before that memo came out in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Afterward, it was thousands of times. And it's just a trigger that keeps people understanding that, they're not allowed to question certain things, and anybody who does is somehow ridiculous or absurd. So, it's a good tool, but it's more of a psychological tool.
Yeah, thank God for people like you and Mike Rupert and Cynthia McKinney and Colleen Rowley and many, many others who speak truth to power. We now know that the Vietnam War was built on a false flag attack. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, totally, confabulated by the shadow government, and it got us into a long, dreadful war. We know that the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, total fiction, totally confabulated, ordered up by the Bush White House like one would order up a pizza with pineapple and ham. He went to the CIA, he said, give me a pretext for war. They talked about yellow cake and weapons of mass destruction. And there we were in Iraq. The pretext for war in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden is there. No, he wasn't. He was in Pakistan. It's all lies. Just talk about that for a second, Kevin.
Yeah, there's a long string of lies that has been sold to us that have facilitated really power grab stories. And, I don't know the whole history myself, but going back to the Reichstag fire in Germany, a fire was put into this government building and blamed on a communist or a person then that kind of enabled the rise of the Nazi regime. And going on from there, you mentioned some of them, but the JFK assassination was a deception. The Gulf of Tonkin is an event that never happened, that turned a CIA war into a huge military effort. The Iran-Contra affair, the 1993 Gulf War, all based on deceptions. The weapons of mass destruction, the anthrax attacks, all provable deceptions, and to the point where you really don't even question them anymore. Most people understand that these were deceptions. So it's a sequence that really 9/11 fits into pretty well.
But why do people want to live in a la-la land? Why not question our government? Why not challenge authority? Why not seek the truth? And why do you have to lose your job? Why does Cynthia McKinney have to, a strong Democrat, the first black woman from Georgia to be elected to Congress, why does she have her own party support a Republican candidate? Why so much opposition? Why do Americans want to live in la-la land?
We actually have another caller, Kevin. Let's try and get that call in, and then we can circle back to more of that. Caller, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of documentaries like In Plain Sight and stuff like that, and I was just wondering if you could comment on. There's three things that I was wondering if you could say if you found that they're true or false, and it's the movers, and those were the guys in the moving van that were cheering after the planes went down, and supposedly they were Israeli special forces or something like that. And then the other one is the gold in the bottom of the towers.
Right.
And then the last one is the owner of the tower saying we pulled it. So he's saying that they put explosives in the towers because of a threat, from a few years back. And I was just wondering if you could comment on any of those. And if not, it's cool. And I love your show. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, caller. Kevin, can you respond to those three areas?
Yeah. And just, if I don't recall them, let me know. But the first was about, I think, related to the dancing Israelis.
Right.
Mossad agents. Yeah, they were Mossad agents who were caught filming and celebrating the events of the World Trade Center. And so, a lot of people don't know, but we were warned by about a dozen governments that an event like 9/11 would occur just before it did that year. And that included later turned out the Israeli government. So a lot of people knew this was going to happen. And, what does it mean that the Israeli agents were caught doing this and they were arrested and later released? Well, it means they had foreknowledge. And foreknowledge is an example of indirect evidence for involvement in the crime. There's a lot of direct evidence, however, people who actually did things that made you understand that they were somehow involved and they knew what was going on. George Tenet is an example. Ralph Eberhardt, the commander of NORAD, is another example. Wirt Walker, who was an insider trader and in charge of the security systems, that's another example of having direct evidence against people as opposed to just foreknowledge. So I think it's interesting, but it should be put in its frame of reference. And then I think there was some question about the gold underneath the building,
Right.
and I believe that's an accurate story, that there was gold below the World Trade Center complex that was removed during the cleanup of the event. And so, where that leads to, I'm not sure. But I think Donald Rumsfeld had some understanding before he died of what that was and why they made it a priority to remove the gold as opposed to looking for victims and looking for evidence, which being, as John said, was being carted off to China for recycling. So, there's a lot that can still be investigated there. And then please help me remember the third question.
The Larry Silverstein had overinsured the Twin Towers. He didn't own them, but he had the long-term lease. He overinsured them for billions of dollars more than they were actually worth. He fought for years to get his money, and he got his money. And then the caller also made a reference to 7 World Trade Center being quote-unquote pulled, which is indicative that he knew it was a controlled demolition.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Larry Silverstein did spill the beans on that, and the fact that he spilled the beans in a public interview indicates to me that he knew what was going on, but he may not have been as detailed, as involved as people might think, because he was dumb enough to come right out and say, yeah, we pulled it, He was telling the story that the Building 7 was demolished. And, that's been brushed under the rug. So, I think it's a very good piece of evidence. Another thing related to Larry Silverstein that a lot of people don't know, that he had called a meeting related to terrorism and invited military ordnance experts on the morning of 9/11 in Building 7. And,
wow.
There are people who were going to this meeting who were not able to go to it after the event started. But they later told us that Silverstein had called this meeting related to terrorism, and it just so happened that then people were there who were explosive experts who might have been able to help with the removal. I think that's maybe the importance of that meeting.
So keep your answers short because we've got a few questions. So first question. How is it that BBC reporters were announcing the collapse of World Trade Center 7 as it still stood in the background on TV sets? Then about a half an hour later, that building did collapse. How did they happen to know that it would happen before it actually happened?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and the only answer to that is that there was a script that was being provided to media representatives, and they were reading the script, and they, in this case, read the script too early. But it wasn't just BBC;
wow.
It was also CNN. For example, CNN made those kinds of comments before World Trade Center 7 had collapsed. So it's a great question, and we need to find out. But BBC's answer was, they must have had some sort of a mix-up. They actually cut the lady's feed as she was telling this story. And that's mysterious as well. Then they lost the tapes of the interview, and then they mysteriously found them again. So BBC has a lot to answer for in that regard.
Kevin Ryan, we have another caller with a question. Caller, if you're listening, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I was actually in New York City at the World Trade Center prior to the 9/11 event, and I was sitting there, people watching, and I noticed a bunch of unmarked vans pull up, and some strange-looking characters get out and load up carts, these very large carts with boxes that were all unmarked and strangely uniformed. And I watched them walk into the bottom of the buildings and walk straight past security without even being checked. And I was like, I have a kind of a background in law enforcement and the military, and just sent the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight up, and it just terrified me because I was like, this is huge. This is an inside job, and there's no one I can tell about this because it's clearly being orchestrated from very high on up.
Was this before the planes hit, caller, or was this after the planes hit?
This was months before.
Oh.
Months before. And I was literally having lunch, and I was just sitting there, and I was sitting on my hat, and I was so terrified by the realization that somebody had a plan to pull these buildings down that I immediately got up and left. And I got about 40 feet away, and I looked back, and I saw my hat, and it was my favorite hat. But I was so terrified to go back towards those buildings that I left that hat and ran the other way.
Yeah, there were reports of quote unquote someone setting up an art installation. They turned out to be an Israeli group. They were never checked. They brought boxes in. Kevin, have you heard that report?
Yeah. There's a little bit of misunderstanding there. The artist project was actually an Austrian group, and they published their entire story later, and there's a lot going on with that, but obviously the buildings were set up for demolition, and so the caller's evidence is really important and good to hear. And so, from what I've learned, obviously this took some time, right? A caller talked about months before 9/11, and so there are things going on actually within the few years before 9/11. There were fireproofing upgrades occurring in the buildings that matched the upgraded floors matched up exactly to where the planes hit and the fires occurred. There were elevator upgrades that were occurring. You may have heard of a company called Ace Elevator that mysteriously disappeared afterward and actually ran from the scene because I think they knew what was going on. But the elevator upgrades allowed the core columns to be exposed as they were being the work was being done. So there's stories about sprinkler mechanics who are going in there, and then some of their associates were murdered later. There's a lot of stuff that could have led to really finding out what happened, but we need to do more work. And the kind of story that the caller has given is a great piece of evidence that needs to be followed up on.
And caller, if you would like to write to the show with any information or a way to be in touch with Kevin Ryan directly, you can write to the show website, Heroes and Patriots, at gmail.com, and we can forward that on to Mr. Ryan. The same caller is back, so let's get that question. All
right. So you have another question?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it wasn't as much of a question as a comment. Maybe you have some more insight on it, though, like you did earlier. I also happened to have been in Washington, D.C. that same summer, and when I flew into D.C., I flew over the Pentagon, and I thought something seemed odd to me when I looked down from my seat, and I went down, and I happened to have an opportunity to go down there. As soon as I landed, I went over there and was checking it out, and I thought this just seemed very eerie to me. Like, there were lots of cars in the parking lots, but no people in all these modular buildings. And there was lots of modular buildings set up around the perimeter of the Pentagon. But I myself, a tie-dyed, long-haired, super freak, pot-smoking hippie, was able to walk all the way up to the front doors of the Pentagon on the lawn. I'm just standing there by myself, and there wasn't a single living body, and nobody asked me anything. And I'm like, how is this possible that our security could be this lax on the Pentagon front lawn?
So you mentioned the Pentagon. That's the other strike that intrigues me. They say that the hijacker at the Pentagon flew his 757 exactly level with the Pentagon for miles. He did a acrobatic corkscrew to get to the level. Even expert flyers couldn't do it. It almost required a robotic type of flight program before crashing directly into the Pentagon's south face, hitting the Pentagon exactly in the budget analyst office, where Department of Defense staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced the day before was missing from the Pentagon due to waste, fraud, and corruption in a press conference on September 10th.
Definitely a lot to investigate with regard to the Pentagon. And, One of them, pointed out by John, is how a plane, a 757, flown by Hani Hanjour, who was known to have not been able to fly a Cessna, hit the building level with the ground on the first floor, flying 500 miles per hour. And how did that happen? How is that possible? Well, in the years before 9/11, the technology of remote control of large aircraft had been perfected to the point where I feel like this was a demonstration of that technology. And so a lot of us believe that the planes were taken over in the air by remote control technology. And so that's one point. Another point is the plane is reported to have hit the exact spot that had just been renovated. I mean, the rest of the building was not renovated, right? But this exact wedge that had just been renovated by a company called Amet Construction, under the guidance of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, had just completed this reconstruction, and that's exactly where the plane hit. And then Amet Construction was hired to clean up the evidence, not only there at the Pentagon, but also at the World Trade Center. So, these are the kinds of leads that we need to follow up on.
Right.
And, why did the hijacker not just crash into the top of the building if that's really what was happening? How did all the leadership of the Pentagon escape? And what was Donald Rumsfeld doing wandering around the parking lot 30 minutes later, instead of defending the country? So there's an extreme number of questions related to the Pentagon that still need to be followed up on.
Kevin, we have about a minute left with you, and I'd like for listeners to be able to read your blog and read your book. Could you just, in the last minute or so, tell listeners how they can listen to you, see your articles, etc.?
Yeah, my blog is called digwithin.net, and my book is called Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects. I do a lot of interviews here and there, not as many as I used to, but if you want to read the book or read the articles, you can contact me through my blog as well. There's an email address there.
Kevin Ryan, this has gone way too fast.
Yeah, it's gone way too fast. We had many more questions, including the lack of the Air Force's response to planes attacking the Twin Towers. No planes were scrambled. It was an utter and total failure of both military intelligence and military response to America being under attack. What happened to Dick Cheney during 9/11? What happened to George Bush? The whole question of the Saudis getting the heads up and being spirited out of the country, as we now know, as President Biden just declassified a treasure trove of previously classified papers. So much to talk about. We hope you come back, Kevin. And listeners, please support this kind of programming at KMUD. Support the station. Support this family of informed, kind, progressive people by becoming a member or underwriter. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Kevin, for being a guest on our show.
At a hotel in Arlington, Virginia. It shows the explosion that followed the crash of American Airlines Flight 77 into the Pentagon, but the video does not show the airplane. The video's existence was disclosed in 2002. The hotel manager says it was confiscated by the FBI. It was just publicly released as the result of a lawsuit.